Westerns, which is most probably a letter from the Bishop of Rome himself, Damasus. Basil says, with reference to these Westerners, quote, "I am not astonished at this. They are totally ignorant of what is going on here," end quote. Then, a little while later, he mentions that there is a specific letter from Rome that supposedly bears upon the schism at Antioch in support of Paulinus against Meletius. I read his comments to you, quote, "I accuse no one. I pray that I may have love to all, and especially unto them who are the household of faith. And therefore I congratulate those who have received the letter from Rome. And although it is a great testimony in their favor, I only hope it is true and confirmed by facts. But I shall never be able to persuade myself on these grounds to ignore Meletius, or to forget the church which is under him, or to treat as small and of little importance to the true religion the questions which originated the division. I shall never consent to give in, merely because somebody is very much elated at receiving a letter from men, even if it had come down from heaven itself, but he does not agree with the sound doctrine of the faith. I cannot look upon him as in communion with the saints," end quote. Such is hardly how one would expect the great Basil to respond to an epistle from Rome if he held the Roman position, as we have seen it defined from the dogmatic constitutions of the Roman Church this evening. He specifically indicates that he does not find Rome to be infallible, even in matters regarding the governing of the church. He further identifies such a letter as coming merely from men, not from the successor of Peter, who is the vicar of Christ. And he goes and gets downright Protestant in insisting that the sound doctrine of the faith cannot be compromised, and instead we must hold to that standard no matter what men may say. Now, unless we wish to sever Basil from the church, and today on the radio program, Mr. Matix indicated that Basil's attitude may have been sinful, yet here is yet more evidence that the papacy has not been the ancient and constant faith of the universal church. While there is so much more that could be presented, I must needs limit our review and turn now to the passages we addressed last evening and provide to you interpretations of those passages from the Fathers. I begin with Luke chapter 22, verses 31 through 32, where the Lord prays for Peter's faith and instructs him when he has turned back to strengthen his brothers. We saw the New Testament does not indicate that this made Peter a pope, nor the prince of the apostles. Dr. Salmon noted with reference to the patristic aspect of the interpretation of this passage, quote, "This prayer to Peter is so clearly personal that some Roman Catholic controversialists do not rely on this passage at all. Neither can they produce any early writers who deduced from it anything in favor of the Roman see. Bellarmine can quote nothing earlier than the 11th century, except the suspicious evidence of some popes in their own cause, of whom the earliest to speak distinctly is Pope Agatho in his address to the Sixth General Council in AD 680, end quote. Needless to say, we do not find the modern Roman interpretation of this passage popping up throughout the writings of the early church. What of John chapter 21? Last evening I quoted, as expressing my own opinion, the words of Cyril of Alexandria, who provided not the Roman interpretation, but the Protestant interpretation. Remember that Vatican I tells us that the Catholic Church has always understood these passages, specifically Matthew 16 and John 21, in the way presented by Rome today. But of course, this is manifestly untrue. The existence of different interpretations without the slightest evidence that those giving those interpretations were attempting to rebel against apostolic doctrine or to be perverse in their opinions not only refutes the Roman contention, but also shows that these men did not find in these passages the very constitution of the church itself as later claimed by Rome. Now I pause only briefly to note that I am unaware of a single father of the Christian faith in the first 700 years of the Christian era who ever connected Isaiah chapter 22, verse 22, with Matthew 16, and then applied this to Peter's supposed successors. Few interpretational stretches are as devoid of patristic support as this one. I would challenge my opponent to provide us with patristic support, not only of his use of Isaiah 22:22, but of the many allegorical, typological interpretations he put forward last night with reference to Peter. Where did the early church speak as you on these subjects is what I would ask Mr. Matitix. We turn then to the pivotal passage, Matthew 16:18. When we look at the patristic information regarding this passage, we find just as wide a variety of interpretations as we find in scholarly literature today, minus those interpretations made by modern scholars who reject the inspiration of the Scriptures. It is easy to understand why many Roman Catholic scholars felt it necessary to leave communion with Rome following Vatican I. For any person, even slightly familiar with patristic interpretation, and slightly concerned about being truthful, would never, ever say that the church has always interpreted this passage as it is interpreted by that council. But before documenting this, I wish to quote a passage from Dr. Salmon that is very important. After going through the various interpretations found in the patristic sources, he writes, quote, "But none of these can be reconciled with the interpretation which regards this text as containing the charter of the church's organization. A charter would be worthless if it were left uncertain to whom it was addressed, or what powers it conferred. So the mere fact that fathers differed in opinion as to what was meant by this rock, and that occasionally the same father wavered in his opinion on this subject, proves that none of them regarded this text as one establishing a perpetual constitution for the Christian church," end quote. It is very important to note, then, that when the Roman Catholic advocate makes Matthew 16 the very charter of the papacy, he is by so doing separating himself from the early church, who saw no such thing in this passage, but instead allowed for a multiplicity of interpretations. The French Roman Catholic Lanois surveyed the patristic evidence and found 17 citations supporting the concept that Peter is the rock of Matthew 16. Please note that this does not mean that all 16 of these fathers also felt that this meant that the Bishop of Rome was a pope, but only that they saw Matthew 16 and the phrase "this rock" as referring to Peter. However, Lanois found 16 citations that identified the rock as Christ himself. He found 8 that identified all the apostles together as forming the rock of Matthew 16. And he found 44 citations indicating that the rock of Matthew 16 was the confession of faith made by Peter in Jesus Christ, the position I presented to you last night. Now, if we add these numbers together, we find that the Roman position, the modern Roman position, which claims to have always been the faith of the Catholic Church, actually represents, in Lanois' survey, 20% of the fathers. 80% of the time, then, the early fathers expressed, in Vatican I's words, perverse opinions at the very best. I might note in passing that even as late as the Council of Trent, one can find even that council referring to this passage as referring to the faith that Peter expressed. But should one Roman Catholic survey not be enough, we turn to the Jesuit Maldonatus, who writes, quote, "There are among ancient authors some who interpret on this rock, that is, on this faith, or on this confession of faith in which thou hast called me the Son of the living God, as Hilary, and Gregory Nyssen, and Chrysostom, and Cyril of Alexandria. St. Augustine, going still further away from the true sense, interprets on this rock, that is, on myself, Christ, because Christ was the rock. But Origen, on this rock, that is to say, on all men who have the same faith," end quote. Was Maldonatus correct? Most definitely so. Let's look, for example, at Hilary's statement regarding Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. It's found in his work De Trinitate, book 6, chapter 37, quote, "This faith it is, which is the foundation of the church. Through this faith the gates